Session which is for delegates only, which means it's a kind of special event for really special people. And we definitely feel privileged to be here and to have such a large audience interested in a country that is a long way away from India, but nonetheless I think has a lot of interesting facets in itself, but also in relation to India. So I can well imagine why it is that this session is so well attended. Of course, the main reason why the place is full is that we have two fabulous books to introduce, written by two superb authors. To my left is Suzy Hansen. I first came across Suzy when she wrote a piece for the New York Times Review about Syrian refugees in Istanbul. And it entirely changed my view of Turkey's policy towards Syria, towards Turkey's policies towards Syrian refugees, and above all, the essential welcoming spirit that Turkey and above all Turks, ordinary Turks, have shown to Syrian refugees. Suzy is a resident of Istanbul, has been for 10 years now. In that time, she has acquired perfect Turkish and has really got under the skin of a society in a way that very, very few Westerners do, and even fewer Americans. She has written this book, Notes on a Foreign Country, which we will be discussing and which she will be signing afterwards. To my right, I have Kaya Genç. Now, Kaya means rock, and Genç means young, so you know what to expect. This excellent journalist and writer has produced a very different book to the one that Suzy has written, and I'm going to enjoy teasing out the differences between the two. Kaya was born and brought up in Turkey. He has spent time abroad. He studied in Amsterdam, but essentially he is that rare beast, a freely operating Turkish journalist and writer working under the Erdogan regime. No doubt behaving himself many times, but also able, because of that proximity, again, to give you a very, very eye-level view, a very street-level view of what's happening in Turkey right now. Because sadly, because of the curtailment of freedom of speech in Turkey, we are having to rely increasingly on people who are either writing under strict censorship or who have left the country. And when you leave the country, of course, that essential proximity is removed. The reason why I'm sitting in the middle is that I, Christopher de Bellaigue, have spent many years in Turkey. I'm a little bit older than these two. I came to Turkey in 1996 to work for The Economist. It was a very, very different country to the one that exists today. Inflation was running as high as 120%. There was a constant fear of military coups, and there was an essential contradiction and tension between democracy, Islam, and the army. All of these contending for power and contending for influence. I left Turkey to take up another assignment in 2000, which was more or less the time, or shortly before, the revolution began, instituted by now President Erdogan. I returned to Turkey, more specifically to Eastern Turkey, to write a book about the Kurds and the Armenians and the Turks. But I will defer to both of these writers when it comes to anything happening after that, because they really have been observing things extremely closely. Now, I want to start with you, Kaya, because your book is a series of portraits, extremely well drawn and meticulously drawn portraits of mostly young Turks. And the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things about this book, Under the Shadow, is that it doesn't come at Turkey from the perspective of someone who thinks that Islam is the main subject. In fact, the word Islam comes up relatively infrequently in these pages. The young people that Kaya interviews and gets to know are interested in many other things, and they have many other influences operating on them. So I'd like to start by asking you, Kaya, to describe how it was that you came at this fascinating cast of characters, and I'm going to ask you to describe one or two of the characters that you find most interesting. So how did you come at this, come at it from this particular angle?
So I love cinema, and I love films by Kurosawa, and I love his film Rashomon. And Gezi event, to me, the uprisings in 2013, was a kind of Rashomon event for me. Something happened, and I could observe it. But
just remind those who aren't familiar with Gezi exactly what happened in 2013.
So, under Erdogan's rule, he was the prime minister then, there was big projects in the country, big urban transformation projects, and there was a growing opposition to his rule. And these two things collided, the opposition and the urban transformation. And when he attempted to transform a public park in Istanbul called Gezi Park, people went there to protest, and they wanted to save the park. And then there was a big outlash of all different kinds of opinion voices coming together.
But it wasn't just about the park, was it? It was about other things too.
It started as a protest to save the park, but after 3 days, other groups joined in order to accelerate the pace of the movement. But people looked at it from very different perspectives. The young people, the leftists, the environmentalists, even those Islamists who didn't agree with Erdogan's rule, they were very passionate. They were there to articulate their views. But another group of the country was also very passionate in their defense of Erdogan against those protesters, because they saw it as a coup attempt. They saw it as a carefully and cunningly conceived way of toppling the government. And so people were very passionate about Gezi, and no one could be cool about it. And I decided to try to be cool about it. And because I knew
and
people...
you are very cool. I mean, your book is remarkable in some ways because it adapts a very detached view and comes very analytically, or it comes very objectively at something that obviously you feel deeply in your heart. And the last word, or the last sentence of Kaya's book is the moment where he reveals himself to be fully human. And he says, "I wept." And I would like to know, why it is. In fact, no. Let's go back to my original question and describe how you got into you got into those characters, and then we'll come back to your own personal involvement.
So I wanted to be cool about Gezi, and so I decided to choose people from different sides of the polarization that Erdogan created. But articulate people, I wanted to be fair. Like I didn't want to pick a very angry and nationalistic but not articulate supporter of Erdogan and put him there and attack him by giving more space to writers who are better educated and who support the anti-Erdogan position. So I tried to find intellectuals or activists who supported political Islam and who thought that its time has arrived in Turkey because apparently they think that it is the time to stage a revolution in Turkey. Supporters of Erdogan think that they are instigating a revolution in Turkey, a cultural revolution, just like supporters of Gezi think that they're part of a revolutionary movement. So it's a war between two revolutionary fronts.
So this is one of your key points. You say that there's a culture of dissent and a culture of rebellion in Turkey, and it's reflected on both sides of the political divide. Give us a portrait of one of the characters that you became most interested in.
One of them, Cenk, he's the one who was among the first 10 people to pitch a tent at Gezi Park. So he's one of the original Gezi protesters. And I could identify with him. He grew up to be critical about Turkish nationalism and the militarist ideology, and his heart was in the right causes. And he read lots of books, and he couldn't conform to the typical Turkish male role models. He wasn't a typical Turkish guy. And so he became an environmentalist, and he wanted to save those trees, and he was handing out these brochures to passers-by. And when he learned that some people were going there to protect the trees, he didn't think twice. He just took a minibus and he went to the park. And he pitched his tent, and with his friends, he's also an artist. He likes drawing and
graffiti artist
a
as
graffiti
well.
artist. So they were like, what slogan shall we come up with? And his friend said, why don't we say Occupy Gezi? Because the Occupy movements were in vogue in those days. And people around them laughed, like, come on, it's just a small protest event. How can we call it Occupy? But they were like, yeah, let's go with it. It's catchy, and it's a nice way to describe it. And people really liked the idea of Occupy Gezi, Occupy Istanbul. And then the movement grew. But there is another person in the book, Begüm, Babin, sorry, her name is Babin. She's Kurdish, and she comes from a Kurdish city, and she grew up hating Turkish nationalism. And she was aware that in Turkey there is this culture of killing Kurds who are vocal about Kurdish history and Kurdish rights. And she thought that Gezi was a coup attempt. She looked at it in a completely different perspective, because she said Erdogan's government is a legitimate government. It was elected to power by the people. And just a month before Gezi events began in May 2013, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the then Turkish president, the then Turkish prime minister, started a Kurdish initiative. He started a Kurdish peace process. So he said, we're going to talk with the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, who had been waging war against the Turkish military for the past 30 years. He said, okay, we're going to make peace with them. We just asked them to give up their guns and sit with us around the table. And so Babin thought that this was a nationalist reaction, not a leftist reaction or an environmentalist reaction, but a nationalist, Turkish nationalist, right-wing reaction to Erdogan's Kurdish peace initiative. And I could see that she was right in her own way. You know, when you look at the Gezi event from her perspective, it was a coup attempt against Erdogan's Kurdish peace initiative because it collapsed at the end. So, as I say, I'm a big fan of films, and I also like Woody Allen's film Zelig. And, you know, Zelig, this character, whoever he talks to, he takes that character's shape. So when he talks with an African-American drummer, he becomes an African-American and he starts drumming, and he changes shape constantly. And I felt like I was becoming a kind of Zelig, because the more I talked to people, the more I agreed with their point of view. And then when I sat down to write the book, I thought maybe that was an interesting perspective to preserve. Maybe that was the cool-headed perspective that I needed to reflect on page. And so
did you yourself attend the Gezi protests? And if so, in what capacity? As an observer, as a participant, as someone who was just checking it out?
Observer. I wasn't a Gezi protester, but I agreed with most of their demands. I wanted the park to be preserved. I didn't like the urban transformation projects, the constant destruction of parks and the constant buildings of shopping malls, and the heavy-handed way the government was adopting. But I also didn't want them to win. I didn't want the Gezi protesters to topple Erdogan, because I thought, just like in Egypt, what has happened in Egypt, that wouldn't be very democratic. You know, maybe the Gezi protesters read better books, and maybe they dress better, and maybe they are more like me. But if they succeeded in toppling the government, I think I'd be very uneasy about that kind of change of government.
And I think in the book you make the point that artists, and I think you're talking about yourself as a writer, as an artist, nowadays in Turkey are observers. And that, I think, is a big change from the time when I was living in Turkey, when artists were always, inevitably, deeply implicated with one faction or another. And often they received money, and it was in their interest to pursue a certain political line. But now we have this group of objective, younger people who are trying to see things from all different perspectives. And I think that is one of the reasons why your book is extremely valuable and useful. Now, to return to this question of the last line. Now, here is Kaya, the objective, detached journalist, weeping. This is after Gezi. This is after a military coup, a failed military coup. It is also after Turkey gets more and more involved in the Syrian imbroglio. And nowadays, this is, of course, on everybody's lips, because Turkey has gone into Syria militarily in a very big way, and the nationalist fever in Turkey is now at an extremely high pitch. So I'd like you to describe how you think things have developed since Gezi in 2013, taking in Syria now, and what your fears are. Because from where I sit, it seems difficult to imagine an improvement in the Turkish situation for the foreseeable future. But having said that, I should remind everyone here that Turkey grew at 11% last year. So you have, on the one hand, this extreme political dysfunction, judicial dysfunction, foreign policy initiatives like adventures, but at the same time, an economy that is in certain sectors just booming.
Yes, these two things work together, and Turkey is now very active in producing its own military guns and all these military systems. So there's a nationalization of industries, and the arms industry is one of those industries. And so Erdogan presented Gezi as a foreign thing. It was designed by foreigners to serve the needs of Angela Merkel and other politicians. And I think that was a very clever strategy, because people are very inclined to be suspicious of foreigners in Turkey. And Kemalists, the followers, those who are passionate supporters of the founder of Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, they share a sensibility with Erdogan in terms of being suspicious about the foreigners. And so Erdogan very cleverly won their vote. He said, if you want to become suspicious of foreigners, come join my party. I'm going to give you the best rhetoric about standing up to the foreigners. And Erdogan is tall. He's very good at giving speeches.
He's a wonderful speaker, wonderful public speaker.
And so after Gezi, he consolidated his power by way of playing to the nationalists, to the secular nationalists. And
so what happened to the Kurds?
He portrayed PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, as a Marxist party, which it is. And he said, you know, they're going to build these cantons, these socialist little communes, and they're going to be discussing Marx and Trotsky all day long. And it's not good for you, you know, the Kurds. You're right-wing like me. You like trade. You want to be entrepreneurs. And so he was supporting Barzani in his Kurdish line of politics, but not the Marxist politics of PKK. So after Gezi, and up to the point where Turkish army entered Syria last week, the Afrin operation, he, I think, readied the Turkish public for this kind of offensive. And so now Turkey is in war with the US. It's a proxy war, but it's a war. And you
heard it here first. This is extremely important. I mean, the idea of Turkey being within NATO and yet being engaged in a proxy war with the US is extraordinary.
And people say it on Turkish TV. You open pro-government channels or anti-government channels. There's this great anti-American rhetoric. People start to speak about the Vietnam War, Cambodia, all these things. And I was watching the Vietnam War, the documentary, and I was like, so are you really concerned about all these people who died in the Vietnam War, or is it like a rhetorical thing? Mm-hmm. But most of the commentators agree on this passionate anti-Americanism these days.
Which leads me neatly towards our other guest, who has written a book which is partly about anti-Americanism, but viewed from the perspective of an intelligent and sensitive and above all inquiring American. Suzy wasn't born into a foreign policy heavy family. She found foreign policy herself, and there are pages in the book, extremely funny pages as well, where she discovers some of the errors or the more interesting byways of American foreign policy in defiance almost of her parents and her entire background in New Jersey. How did you find yourself moving to Turkey, and what was it that impelled you to go when your friends around you looked at you as if you were completely crazy?
Yeah, at the time I was about 28, 29 years old, and I was living in New York. I was a journalist, and I sort of had a life already. I had never really indicated to anyone that I was going to go abroad, and I knew no one who was living abroad. I really had, you know, no connection to any foreign countries. I didn't speak foreign languages, but I had been in New York during September 11th, and so it was this kind of incredible time when all of a sudden Americans were reading about Islam as if they were discovering it for the first time. They were reading about Al-Qaeda, they were reading about Taliban, they were reading about Afghanistan. What did we do in Afghanistan? This was all kind of this new and kind of engagement because, of course, they were very scared. But then after that, New York kind of faded into this, or it was subsumed by this economic boom. And it was kind of this go-go period where Wall Street was booming. And I felt like we kind of lost that period of introspection. And I grew up at the Jersey Shores, which is outside of New York, and so when you grow up there, you feel inferior to New York your whole life, and all you want is to go to New York because you think all of the answers are going to be sort of found there. And I was actually left after this period feeling like, okay, something has happened, none of us understand what it is, and I'm not going to figure it out in New York at all, because in fact, as everyone knows, a lot of the liberals and maybe even people who were quite left-wing were supporting the war in Iraq, and it was a very strange period. So I thought I needed to move abroad to learn anything, essentially, and that was one reason I wanted to apply for this journalism fellowship. The reason I chose Turkey is really quite random because, as I said, I had no connection to anywhere. So one of the reasons was that I noticed that there wasn't a lot written about Turkey in the United States. A lot of journalists had moved to Iraq and Afghanistan to cover that, but Turkey was not a country that was covered very much, so I thought it was an opportunity. The other reason that I didn't really tell anyone about for a long time was that my favorite writer was James Baldwin. And when I was about 25 years old, I watched this documentary about him in which he said that he felt in so many words, he felt more comfortable as a gay black man in Istanbul than he had felt in Paris or New York. And to a kind of naive white girl, you know, in America, this was completely mind-blowing. I think it kind of put Istanbul in my mind as this place that I didn't know anything about, I should know something about. And I think because I recognized I didn't understand anything east of London, basically. But I think also because I was so interested in Baldwin and what he had to say about black-white relations, I started to think that maybe Baldwin was the key to understanding white America's relationship with the rest of the world.
And your book contains a fascinating section. After you arrive in Istanbul, you find this old friend of Baldwin called Engin Cezar, and you go and have an extraordinary series of conversations with him. Tell us a little bit about him and what you learned from him.
Well, Engin and James Baldwin met in New York at the Actors Studio. It's a famous, playwriting. It's a theater company. And Engin was an actor, and James Baldwin was studying playwriting, and this was in the 50s. And they kind of bonded being the other. I mean, there was the Turkish man and the African American, and I think Engin had at one point saved James Baldwin during a fight where he was attacked. And so they had this bond, and at some point, Baldwin, who was always having these kind of emotional breakdowns because it was the 60s in the US and it was terrible, and he came to Istanbul sick, and he showed up at Engin Cezar's doorstep and he said, I can't take this anymore, I need your help. And so he ended up staying in Istanbul for that reason, and I wanted to, I was really kind of lost at this point trying to figure things out, but I wanted to talk to someone who knew Baldwin at that time. And Engin Cezar was this interesting type because he was himself kind of, he was in his 80s, 70s, 80s at that point. He was very much a child of the early republic. He was a Kemalist, in some way, but he was also a leftist, and he really had...
So he was deeply secular.
He was deeply secular. And he was very much against the current regime. But he also had witnessed this evolving relationship with the United States. He was a child in the 40s when the United States claimed Turkey in the Cold War, so to speak. And he watched this relationship develop with some trepidation, as did Baldwin. And so we have this exchange, and at one point, he's criticizing the US a lot, and I'm still quite new to all of this, and he says, and I say, well, wouldn't America be a country that James Baldwin would like to come home to now because our president was Barack Obama? And he immediately said, bullshit, kind of, how could you think this is all so simple? And it was one of the major sort of turning point moments for me about all that I did not understand. And that's why my book is mostly about trying to understand why Americans fail to understand.
There's a nice anecdote about the USS Missouri.
Yeah, the USS Missouri was actually bringing the body of Munir Ertegun home. He was the ambassador to...
This is in about what year?
This is 1946.
So entering this massive battleship.
Yes.
Entering the Bosphorus.
Yes, and he was actually bringing home the ambassador to Turkey, Munir Ertegun, who is the father of Ahmet Ertegun, who is the founder of Atlantic Records. Anyway, so they were bringing the body home, but the USS Missouri was, of course, this famous battleship, and so they were coming up the Bosphorus. It was this kind of grand, approach, but it was also 1946, so they were sort of saying, in so many words, you are ours. We will protect you, we will claim you from the Soviet Union. Let's sort of have this alliance. And the Turks at that point loved America, and I think this was also very surprising to me because I didn't realize that. And they kind of, well, some of the Turks anyway, and they cleaned up the city, and they kind of scrubbed the taxis, and they cleaned the brothels, and they got everything. And then there was also, they strung in lights, welcome in English, between minarets. Yes. And at that time, Engin Cezar was maybe 8 years old or so, and he ran down to see the USS Missouri and to meet some of these American Navy officers, and they, of course, gave out candy the way that Americans do, and all of the kids got sick because they had never seen that kind of chewing gum before, and the kids were all sick the next day. And as Engin Cezar said,
because they swallowed it rather than...
They swallowed it, yeah, sorry. And so as Engin Cezar said, and that was the beginning of our relationship with America. And and this is, I'm in Turkey basically for about a year at this point, so I realized I had a lot to learn.
So a lot of what you're saying up here on stage is how much you don't understand or you didn't understand. But your book is about a journey towards at least a partial understanding. And after 10 years, I think you're in a vantage point to say quite a lot. Let's pick up that question of political Islam that Kaya Genç deliberately does not address in his book because he's dealing with other issues. Your book does address the question of political Islam because, of course, any Western journalist, it's the first thing in their inbox is, can you write 900 words on political Islam? What was your feeling when you first saw Recep Tayyip Erdogan? We were discussing earlier, and I said that I'd met Recep Tayyip Erdogan when he was still mayor of Istanbul, and this was in the late 1990s. And he was considered by many in the West to represent a new form of Islam, which Westerners immediately described as moderate Islam. Of course, Recep Tayyip Erdogan was happy to receive the plaudits and the money and the support, but he was not happy with that phrase because Islam is Islam, you cannot qualify it. He very kindly invited me when I was a journalist to one of the Ottoman summer houses that he had restored, and he wanted to show off the restoration. And we had the most delicious spring early strawberries, and I was pretty charmed. And I wrote what I now think is an unforgivably favourable piece about this young rising politician. So I'd like to know if you were similarly charmed, and I'd like to know how your relationship with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, such as it is, has developed.
We have not had strawberries or any fruit. So I arrived in 2007, so this was the second election that AKP and Erdogan won, and it was a period when a lot of liberals were rallying around him because the supposedly secularist military was threatening to intervene in this election. I don't know if we want to go into the details, but there was going to be it looked like there was going to be a president who was a former Islamist and a prime minister who was a former Islamist, and this seemed very dangerous to a lot of secularists, and there were protests and everything else. And, I think a lot of what I'm trying to do in the book is just show that, foreign journalists and foreigners are bringing so much baggage to everything that they are looking at when they come to a foreign country. And I'm coming from post 9/11 New York, and I'm a liberal myself, et cetera, and I had seen this kind of rise in Islamophobia in the US. So I arrive and I see that I kind of see this party, this former Islamists that is being persecuted by an elite. And like a lot of liberals at the time, I was sympathetic to them. And it is something that I try to grapple with all the time today. But I think that there was another thing, and I tried to show this in my book, that why was that party, why was I sympathetic to them? Why did they not seem threatening to me when they seemed threatening to other people? And I think that part of it was the language that Erdogan used very brilliantly, which was the language of liberalism. It was the language of American liberalism. He talked about being, he was pro-business, and he was all, even though I was myself a lefty, I probably would have described, these kinds of words sounded like something that was familiar to me. And so the fact that he was a former Islamist, I think it was kind of smoothed over to some degree. And I think that there are very real reasons also, because the party was very, very popular, and so, but I think that what I wanted to try to draw out was to understand how, Americans have this very deep-seated reflex that responds to capitalism. And I think that often we are really not very much aware of it, because we're not aware of how much we're deeply invested in our own system being the model for the world. And I think that was...
I think you're absolutely right. I think that it is deeply reassuring for an American to arrive in a foreign country and to see a Starbucks. And that is what started to happen after, not you perhaps, but for many it is that on a very basic level, it is the brand recognition, it is the sense of feeling at home. I think it's important to remind people why it was that so many intelligent observers of Turkey were enthused by Erdogan, and not simply outsiders, but also a lot of people inside the country. And both of you have alluded to this. There is a contradiction between iron-hearted and possibly unconstitutional secularism, and democracy, and then Islamism. And this three-pronged trident of contradictions continues to exercise Turkey to this day. But in those early years, let's say the first 5 years of Erdogan, what did he do? What were the achievements?
Well, I mean, they were to some degree pro-European Union reforms and European Union accession, so they made a lot of these reforms, that's right. They passed a lot of laws that to a lot of people symbolized or actually represented a kind of modernization moving towards Europe, even though I think that it was always complicated, their feelings about that.
Was there human rights
and
advances?
human rights advances, and of course they were, even the language that they used about the Kurds and about the Kurdish issue, Erdogan famously went to the East and said, I am a black Turk like you, and those were the white Turks, and he made these kind of gestures, I think, that were very different. I mean, he was using a different kind of language. He was also very much tackling the headscarf issue at that time, which many people saw as undemocratic, and most importantly, he got
Just remind people quickly the bare bones of the headscarf issue.
At that time, women still could not go to university if you were wearing a headscarf, and you couldn't work in many state institutions if you were wearing a headscarf. And I think Erdogan's daughter also had to go to school in the US because of this, right? So he was very much against that, of course. And then the most important thing, though, was that he got the military out of politics. And this was so important to so many, not only religious people at all, but leftists especially. And that was why we had this kind of, some leftists, and we had this kind of interesting alliance of AKP and the liberals. So I think that those were the main, am I leaving anything out? And the economy. The economy was just really booming. Istanbul was changing before our eyes, and it's really quite interesting that people were, I think especially foreign journalists, were really lauding this development and how wonderful the city worked and everything else, and it just switched so quickly to overdevelopment, environmental destruction, and a lot of things that brought us Gezi Park.
And this, of course, is a warning for all countries, all large countries in the process of pell-mell development, and exactly where you draw the line and where you start to rein in that development, because it is causing the destruction of other important things. Kaya, what were you?
I started work as a Newsweek reporter. My first job in Istanbul was as a Newsweek reporter, and Newsweek was just opening its Turkish edition. And we had this huge poster on the walls. And it was a Newsweek cover that said, "The cool Istanbul," with partying, like the Europeans partying in Istanbul. So that was the Newsweek cover we had at the end of 2009.
And how did you feel about that cover? Did you feel that it was representative of the Istanbul that you knew?
I didn't believe that cover. Because I could see that there was some intellectual interest in Turkish matters by writers like you, by essayists, by intellectuals in the West, but mostly in London and in New York. The interest was more touristic. So people were looking for a nice city to party in, or maybe a country where they could buy property. So when I go to London, for example, I see lots of elderly British people who have property in Turkey, in the Mediterranean coast, on the Mediterranean coast, and so they're more concerned about their property there. So that's the kind of reason of their interest in Turkey. And so that Newsweek cover was, I think, very significant, and I think it will always be remembered as a example of, I think, bad journalism, because when you look at a city, you have to understand what is going on there, and you cannot just approach it like an Orientalist or like a tourist on a safari. You know, it's not just the lights and the colors and the delicacies that the city offers you. There is more to the city than that. The people are there. And so when I was looking at the writings by Westerners in the 19th century, what they wrote about Istanbul, it reminded me of that Newsweek cover. You know, they write about architecture and the dogs on the street, but they don't talk to people, and they don't know about their frustrations, about their angers, and about their passions. So
And there's a tendency, I think both of you would agree, to come in on for a very short period and then to draw enormous conclusions. And one of the most famous Western travel books about Istanbul is D'Amici's Constantinople. And it was only after reading it that I discovered he'd spent all of a week in Constantinople before he wrote this enormous, beautifully written tome about the harem and the delights and the sights and the smells. But really you had very little sense that the city was undergoing profound seismic changes, some of which went deep into society. If we're discussing a kind of Erdogan high watermark and then we're going to say that things started to go wrong, is there a point that you can say, this is the moment I would say when, from my perspective as someone who loves Turkey and wants it to be happy, things started to go wrong?
Well, I think in retrospect we know a lot more about this, or I was not paying attention at the time. I don't think that, I mean, maybe the high watermark was 2007, because very soon after there were a lot of changes being made behind the scenes, you know, to the judiciary. There were these legal trials that are kind of complicated to get into, but there were a lot of ways, so there was a lot of ways in which the party had
the legal trials were essentially, again, the ruling party getting rid of internal enemies. Internal
enemies and opposition. But I think there was also a very important thing happening that I think a lot of people did realize, which was that there was this transfer of wealth going on. I mean, the AKP, when they were running, had made all these promises to their oppressed constituency that they were going to open up Turkey to new businessmen, and everybody was going to have a piece of the pie and all of that. And there was a kind of underhanded way that you know, in terms of rigging tenders and bids for state projects, that there was this kind of transfer of wealth from an old elite to a new elite, which is something that is almost naturally always going to happen. But I think that the problem in this case was that because he was constantly talking about human rights and liberalism and all of these wonderful values, I think a lot of the West especially wasn't paying attention to what was happening. So this is 2008, 9, 10, I would say.
And the Syria business, did that raise alarm bells for you, going into Syria, turning against Assad?
I just think, I don't know, I mean, it was part of this like larger foreign policy that Davutoglu had been proposing of sort of more involvement, but not hostile involvement with nations. And then once the Arab Spring, they weren't prepared for the Arab Spring. And then I think that, yeah, to me, it just seemed that Erdogan had become an imperialist, which seemed very different from the first decades of Turkish history, where the Turkish military had been more defensive than they had been offensive. And so it was sort of like, well, what is Erdogan doing? You know, he has brought in this kind of really insanely fast capitalist revolution, and now he is hungry for more territory, more. I mean, it sort of seemed like a familiar story in a way.
And the Turkish model was being spoken of, you know, at least at the beginning of the Arab Spring, as something that could be emulated, or at least parts of it imported.
Yeah, and I think that, and I would be curious what Kaya says about this. I mean, I think to a lot of Turks, the fact that a lot of people in think tanks were calling Turkey a model of anything, just it was very clear to a lot of people that they didn't really know the history of the country or why Turkey is so different from a lot of the Arab world. And so I'm sure it was frustrating to see Turkey being held up as a model, or no?
It was frustrating. I remember I remember BBC asking Egyptians whether they would like Turkey to be a model for them. And they were saying, no, we'll come up with our own model. Why are you asking the question even? And they were like, because we are the BBC, we like model countries. And I think there was a frustration that all the NGOs were supporting the government for a time. And there was this constant unification between the civil society and the government. And I think even the artistic community, like Erdogan's government, was supporting them in big ways. And I think people were uneasy about this. So after 2006 and 2007, people were becoming very frustrated about this alliance between the government and the NGOs and the artistic community. And so Gezi was an expression of how people were actually frustrated about these things. So it was an articulation of their real views. So in order to pursue their own self-interests, I think people were aligned with the government, and the NGOs were included in that. The Open Society Institute, for example, in Turkey, was a big supporter of the government, and then it shifted its position. And so when you look at NGOs and the artistic community, you can say, well, you are getting all your funding from this government.
Yeah.
And do you expect it just to disappear? You know, you helped it become a big thing, and now more than 50% of the country supports Erdogan, and he and his party cannot just disappear. And so I think.
So this is really the big conundrum that we have now is that tension between democracy. You have a democratically elected government, albeit with a slim majority, a president that clearly sees himself as a president for life, but very, very strong minorities who are opposing him. And what's your conclusion to this great exploration of what it means to be an American at the tail end of the American imperium, looking back at the Marshall Plan, because this book isn't simply about Turkey, it's also about Greece, it's about Egypt, it's about, also extends into Afghanistan. So there's a big view of American involvement. And where does that, leave American foreign policy, and where does it leave you?
I mean, what I was really trying to do with this book is address, you know, this sort of detachment detachment that individual Americans feel from their foreign policy. So why is it that as an individual, as an American, do you not feel some relationship to the rest of the world? Are you not aware of the fact that you have this kind of intimate relationship with the rest of the world? Why don't you know the history? And I think, you know, it's funny, some of my Turkish friends have said to me, you know, well, we don't know about parts of our own eastern country, and we don't know about Iraq. You know, why do you expect Americans to know about all of these places? And of course it is different, because Turkey for a long time anyway wasn't invading Iraq, and they didn't have a tremendous amount of control over people's economic policies and various other things. And I think that I felt very pessimistic at the end of this book, because I think that Americans have so much to learn about who they actually are, but they have been subjected to so much intense propaganda about their place in the world that they don't think it's propaganda, they think that it is actually the truth. So
and you say that American self-confidence was shattered by Vietnam. It was shattered again.
Yeah. Nixon, Watergate.
It was shattered again in 2003, but we never learned.
No, because we have this, we can always return to this place of innocence. We can always sort of regenerate that feeling of innocence, and that is something that has been very much designed for us since the end of World War II and the Cold War. And so by the end of this book, I am still failing to understand Turkey, because I think that there are a lot of ways in which if you have these views as an American, if you believe that you are the end of the evolutionary spectrum when it comes to nations, you will always be sort of looking at other countries through that prism, and it's certainly not objective. You certainly can't be an objective journalist, and it's often really quite unfair. And so I think we have a lot of work to do.
Let me just, before we go for one or two quick questions, let me say that failure to understand has resulted in a really magnificent and a book that is written from the heart. And on this side, Kaya's entirely different approach has yielded the most fascinating series of portraits of young Turks that I know will surprise you, because they're not what you're expecting. We've got, I've run hopelessly over time. Very quick questions, please. You in the front there.
Yeah, to Kaya, why is he called Under the Shadow?
Sorry, what the question is?
Why is the title of the book Under the Shadow?
Why is the title of the book Under the Shadow? Hold on one sec. One more. Yes, lady back there. No, that's you, yeah.
Sure. Are there things you feel like you still don't understand either on an intellectual or emotional level about Turkish politics, daily life? And Kaya, same for you, if there's anything you still are kind of struggling to comprehend.
Okay, let's start with why did you choose Under the Shadow? Under the Shadow of what?
I was considering the title Angry Young Turks because I wanted to put the Young Turks in the cover, but then we decided that that would be a more subtle title, Under the Shadow, because under the shadow of this thing, Erdogan and his rule, some people feel safe, but some people are threatened by what it can do. So it gives the double view of people. So that's why we picked it.
Yeah, the shadow could be ominous, or you could be shadowing from a very strong sun, and it could be giving you comfort. Well, the things that still trouble and torment you that you haven't quite got to yet.
Well, the problem is that I don't know. I mean, it's the things that are yet to be discovered that I'm still not aware of. I think that the main thing that I realized after many years was just what an intense understanding of a country's history you really need to have. You weren't there in the 70s, you weren't there in the 80s. You really don't understand what the texture of life was like in those periods. You're lacking so much information, so it really requires that you read a lot of memoirs, read a lot of journalism from that place. And I think that, for example, you know, there's this kind of idea that there's a secularist military in Turkey, and then Erdogan is rebelling against that and all of that. But if you study it a little bit, you realize that, you know, the secularist military that staged a coup in the 1980s in many ways is responsible for the rise of Erdogan, that the secularist military wasn't in fact entirely secularist, that religion has maybe a place in Turkish society and a relationship to the state that is much more subtle and much different from the way that we understand it, at least from the newspapers. So I think that it is just that constant challenge of just going deeper and deeper into history so you can understand how we got to where we are now. I mean, that's kind of what I...
And we haven't even dealt with the failed coup, which basically represents a division between two strands of Islamism trying to retain power. One more question. You.
I visited Turkey 10 years ago. It was Kemal Atatürk's Turkey that I had in mind before I went, and I was not disappointed at all. It was very much secular, modern, westernized Turkey that I saw, and I was even mentioning to my friends, I could as well be walking through one of those western cities. Now, after this Erdogan came to power, he has been steadily dismantling the whatever secular edifice Atatürk built and whatever modern Turkey Atatürk built. During a conversation with the ordinary people, do they remember Atatürk at all? Are they not nostalgic about him?
Do people remember Atatürk and his legacy?
I think it's been revived. Atatürk's legacy has been revived, and by Erdogan, of all people. Erdogan is also using his legacy because he knows that it's a unifying legacy, and it's interesting, it's a very complicated issue, but Erdogan is cutting some of his ties with political Islamists, and he's become a Turkish statist, and he's becoming more supportive of Atatürk's legacy, maybe not in terms of secularism, but in other aspects.
And there we have the possibility of another discussion which would bring in the relationship of India and Gandhi. So we're going to do that, I think, next time, Willie? Thank you very much. I thank my panelists, and thank you very much.
Thank you. That was very nice.